Hi there makers, it is Jo here from Minerva, and after the success of my 20 ways to use a seam gauge, I started delving into my mind about 20 ways we could use something else, and I started to think about pinning. You might be using the same pins, or you've had the same pins for a long amount of time, but now you're starting to branch out into different fabrics. It's time to think of some different pinning techniques. So here is 20 different ways to use pins. There's no right or wrong way to pin, but the more techniques you have, the more you can switch them in and out for different projects. So if you're new to sewing, my number one tips are, how do you pin? If you're new to sewing, it's good to have a new tin of pins because you know they're all sharp and not bent or anything. So you take your fabric, right sides together is usually what you'd be asked to do. And you want to make sure that the pin is secure. So putting the pin in like this won't keep your fabric together. It will just fall out. So you need to put it in and back out again, so all of the pin is on one side. You can pin vertically like this, or you can pin diagonally, and I'll go into the reasons why later in the video. Number two, if you have a bad pin, throw it away straight away. Don't put it back in the tin or your pin cushion, because you'll only pick it up again, and it will really feel like you're only ever picking up that bad pin. So this is a silk pin that's been used in a fabric that's too thick, so it's bent it. So you need to make sure you're using the correct pins for the weight of your fabric. This one appears okay, but the tip is very blunt, so I'm struggling to get that one through, and it's got a slight bend. It looks old, the head's worn away as well, so that one's no good. You can also find that it goes in, but you can feel it catching, and that might have a burr on it or been caught by a machine needle if you've been sewing over them, or it's just got damaged. They can go in and feel really sticky. Now, I know this is a cheap pin. It's got a sort of bit of rusting happening on the shaft there, and that came in just a gift kit, so it wasn't a great quality pin to start with. You can also find a few problems if you use the wrong pin. So this is a really big pin. I love them because they're really nice and long, but when you try and pull them out under the machine, it pulls the fabric out of position. You want your pin to go in easily and come out easily. In my background, you will always see this little denim bucket bag, but actually it holds a glass jar with pins and blades and sharps and needles that are all ready to be thrown away. So whenever I get a bad pin, I throw it in the jar. I take these to be recycled at my local recycling centre because it's a special place for pins and sharps. I put them into a plastic box, a takeaway container, or something that contains them so they're safe for people to handle. Number three, talking of different types of pins, there are different pins for different fabrics. So the more of a seasoned sewer you become and the more you switch from one different fabric to another, you might need a different pin. These are a pearl head pin, and you can differentiate these by their size and the type of head. I keep my pins in separate tins. I've got long ones and short ones. It's sometimes easy if you select one pin head type to keep separate to another. My next choice for a different style of pin is a really long pin, and I find it really useful for coat making, and they've got a really long shaft on them, so they're good for going through different types of fabric. Ideal if you've got something firm like a cord. They're really nice and sharp, but they're long, so they hold down longer areas of fabric. Ideal for thick fabrics like fleece. If you use a little pin, this is just a dressmaker's pin, it's really hard to get through and they can get lost in the fabric, and you need to put lots of them in. It's so much easier to just put in a few good long pins. It's really good as well to have some long pins if you're using textured fabrics. It's got that glass ball on the end so it doesn't get lost in the pile or texture of the fabric. Long pins are ideal for boiled wool because you soon build up some layers, so you'll be wanting something quite long to be able to get through one side and another. If you're using quilted fabric or you're quilting your own fabrics, then long pins are great because as soon as you start to build up some layers, you'll need a nice long pin to get through them. You can also switch to clips at this point if you're getting more and more layers, and I'll talk about clips a bit more in a moment. For quilting, I like to use these long pins, but they're great for jackets and coats, and I keep them in a separate tin to my smaller dressmaking pins. A slightly more specialist pin for you to check out if you're using lots of jersey fabrics is a ballpoint pin. So these are quite small and they don't have a deep head on, so they're easy to distinguish between your pins with heads on. They look more like a dressmaking pin, but they're a little bit longer, and they're ideal for piercing through fabrics with high elastane or lycra content. They've got a ballpoint tip, so they don't shred the fabric or make a little snag, and they're really good as well if you're using activewear fabric. Because they don't snag, you can use your pins vertically, which you might not be able to do with other pins. You would have to pin within the seam allowance, or you would use clips. And I'm really picky about when I use clips because I hate clips when the fabric doesn't hold the weight of them, because it just maneuvers the fabric out of position. When you take ballpoint pins out of lycra fabric, it doesn't leave any holes or marks. Other specialty pins you might start to move towards if you change your fabric choices are silk pins. These are really, really fine. They've got a thin shaft, a really sharp point, and they're light, and they're ideal for light, delicate fabrics. And normally with chiffon you would pin in the seam allowance, but I can pin vertically because the pins are the correct type for the fabric. So when I take them out, they don't leave any marks, holes or snags. You can only use them with delicate fabric, because if you try and use them with thicker fabrics, you'll end up with lots of bent pins. Keep silk pins in a separate tin so that you can distinguish them between others. They're also useful again with activewear if you pin in the seam allowance, because they're nice and fine and sharp. They don't leave holes in the fabric. If you like to use pins with a bigger head on for dexterity reasons, then quilters pins are great. They're long. These are 54mm long, and they've got that large head on the top, which makes them easy to collect. I've got some different ones here, heart ones, flat ones, and they're really great when you're using thicker fabric. So I've got a quilting fabric here. They're nice and long, so they'll go through thicker layers. That's why they're called quilting pins, because quilters use them to hold a topper and batting and a lining all together. They're great for specialty fabrics like sweater knits, because they're nice and long, so you can put them in twice and they won't slip out. And again, you could go back to furs and textured fabrics because you can see them and then don't get hidden in the pile of the fabric. They have the bonus of being long but still very fine and thin. I said I would take you back to clips, so you can see here I've got lots of layers, so I'm using clips to hold down some quite thick areas. It's flat on the bottom and curved on the top, so the flat bit goes underneath and the curved bit on the top when you sew. And either of those work really well for thicker fabrics. Some people use clips for all of their sewing. I like to use them only for fabrics that will support the weight of them. This is a leather, and I couldn't use a pin here because I would leave pinholes in the fabric, but I could hold the fabric and it doesn't flop around, so it's easy to control under the machine. I tend to mostly use them for bag making. Dressmaking pins are much smaller. These are 27mm long, so they're more suited to working on a mannequin or draping your fabrics. They're called dressmakers pins, and you might use them and you might really like them for sewing, then go for it. But I find them a little bit small and fiddly. If I drop them on the floor, I can't find them. I tend to lose them quite a bit, but they're great for working on a mannequin. I find them a little bit too short for putting through layers of fabric. Looking at some really specific pin types now. So this is a set of fork pins, and it's 2 pins with a hook shape. So it's got a little hook that sticks up on the ends, so that is what you grab hold of, and it's ideal for any fabric that's quite holey, like tulle, mesh, silk, anything like that. It's like double pinning. If I just put in a single pin through a very holey fabric, then very easily, if the fabric moves around, then it falls out. With the fork pins, I get a little bit more grip, and I can take those under the machine and pull them out as I go. They're really sharp. You can get them in different lengths. I also have the fork pins because I do some hand knitting. This isn't hand knitting, but I just wanted to show you how they worked. They hold the fabric together firmly while you sew up your pieces together. There is a drawback with fork pins. They're an absolute nuisance to get out of the tin. They all get hooked on each other and you end up with them all over the place. So they're best stored in a pin cushion. Number 4 is to make sure that your pins are in the direction which you're sewing so that you can pull them out easily. Pins like this, it might seem like easier to pin in the first place, but it gets so much more tricky when you take your eye off the pins and then you're sewing and you're having to try and get your pin out from under the foot. Always put your pins, number 4, in the direction of your sewing. Number 5 is to make sure you use the correct pin with your fabric. So here's a silk pin and that's nice and fine. This prim pin is a lot bigger, so it's made a little mark in the fabric. And you can get those out here, look, with a little trick. If you get a teaspoon and you rub the fabric, it just redisperses all of the weft and warp threads and you can remove pin marks. Number 6 is to sew up to the pin. So don't take that pin out too soon or you'll lose the position of your fabric. So right up to it, you can get a little bit closer with a vertical pin. But what you're aiming for is to keep the pins in for as long as possible to stop the fabric raw edges from drifting. Number 7 is to double pin. So if you're using a fabric like a charmeuse or a satin, a chiffon or something that's really light, so particularly something that's slippy like these two fabrics, then you can actually put in 2 pins to act as one. It means that the pin won't slip out of the fabric when you're moving it around. You can also double pin by using a single pin but putting it in and out twice. It will hold the pin in position and it will stop it falling out as you move your fabric pieces around. If you just put in a single pin, sometimes you find if you move your piece or pack it away from one day to the next, the pins all start to fall out. Double pinning is much better. Number 8 is how should I pin? Should I be pinning parallel to the raw edge, vertical to the raw edge, or diagonally to the raw edge? It really does depend on which part of your pattern you are on and what you want your pins to do. It's always good to have a little selection of techniques so you can switch in and out depending on which part of your pattern you're on. You could be pinning parallel to the seam, so your pins are in the same plane as the raw edge. This is suitable for straight seams or where you've got a really long seam, so say down the outside of a trouser leg, so that when you take it through the machine, you can pull your pins out as you sew. Parallel pinning holds down more of the fabric because it's holding down the fabric from tip to the head and that bit in between, so it's holding down that whole section. You can pin vertical to the raw edge, so your pins are going in the opposite direction, and people find this useful because as they're sewing they can take the pins out as they sew. You can sew really close to the pin, but it's not holding down so much of the fabric, so it's really only holding the fabric down in a very narrow place, whereas when we had it parallel, that's holding down more of the fabric. So that might be something you want to consider. You might also see people pin it this way but still vertical, and that might just be to do with the orientation of maybe lots of fabric and lots of garment to handle, so it's on your lap, so you pin it in a way that's comfortable. Or left-handers might find it easier to pull the pins out from this side. Another variation of this is to pin diagonally. This is a sort of mix of both of those methods because it's holding down more fabric from tip to head, but they're easy to remove as you sew. Again, useful for longer lengths. And we'll talk about a few more tips for pinning vertically later on. Pinning parallel is great if you need to pin within the seam allowance. Vertical and diagonal are great if your fabric will stand the pinholes. Number 9 is actually less is more. So if you're adding elastic, you might be using pins as a marker. And it's sometimes easier to just pin in the marker points rather than all the way along the elastic, because you want to be able to manipulate that elastic and stretch it and move it as you sew. You can use it to get halfway points and markers. You might use quarters, you might put it in half. That means you'll evenly distribute the elastic. If you had all pins in this now, you wouldn't be able to control the elastic with your thumb and forefinger because you would be too busy thinking about the pins. I can just take one out like that quickly, but really I want to be holding the tension of the elastic. So sometimes less pins is better than more pins. It means that I get an even distribution of the elastic. I can put the other elastic in the other side with the same tension by marking the halfway point and stretching the elastic equally on both sides. You might also be using it in a waistband, or I've got an underbust here, so I've quartered the fabric with a pin, and then I know I'm spreading the same amount of ease throughout the sports bra top. So number 9 is sometimes less is more when you're using elastics. Sometimes you might need to use tacking instead of pins. So I'm making the Carolyn pyjama top here, and I want to get all of the facings and the lapel pieces right. And I've got to sandwich a facing and a collar. And if I pin that with the collar and the facing, just with one row of pins, I might start to lose the positioning of that curve. So the collar is tacked on. That's the first stage. And now I can pin on the facing because I can be really accurate. I can look for that marker point there, which is really crucial to the lapel sitting correctly. But I'm not worrying about anything moving underneath because that's all tacked in position. Now I've got that opposite curve to try and work, and I don't want to be trying to do that with the collar pinned as well. So now I can just concentrate on getting all of the facing in the correct place. I can pin the beginning and the end and then start to work the curve. Vertical pinning is particularly good for sleeve heads because you can put lots next to each other and take up the ease of the fabric. So you can see here in the sleeve head, I've got extra fabric on the sleeve side and less on the top side. The other great thing about putting in vertical pins is I'm pinned it from this side because I find it easier to hold the tension of the fabric at the front and allow the ease to gather at the back. But I want to sew it from this side so that I can make sure that I'm not getting any ripples or puckers. So vertical pinning does have advantages because you can sew from either side. Number 11 is vertical pinning when you're working with gathers. So here you've got a flat back but a gathered top, and it's really much easier to manipulate if you pin vertically. If you pin parallel to the seam, you end up folding your gathers down flat and creating little pleats, and you won't get such an attractive gather. Pinning vertically means you can almost pin each gather individually if you've got the patience, but you can spread the load a little bit easier that way. So here you can see I've evenly gathered the fabric. It's gathered on this side. It remains completely flat on the back, and I will sew from this side. Number 12 is to use your last pin as a stiletto. So if it's crucial that your ends are together, take out your last pin and use it to maneuver and manipulate the fabric, and you can hold it in place. That way you get really equal ends if you need that to be crucial for hemming, for example. We're up to 13 and I'm grouping a few things here. So I'm looking for some pinning techniques if you are an intermediate sewer or you're a little bit past beginner and you want to move your pinning onto another level. I like to put my pins parallel, not vertical like this, because I'm busy looking here. I forget that the blade here is going to catch that pin, and it really does damage the blade. I've had to change a blade when it caught a pin and it was really hard to get out. You can move your pins slightly further away to keep them out of the way, but then you will get some drifting on the raw edges there. You can see I'm just having to readjust that. But parallel pinning right where my fingers are is ideal. Number 14 is to use pins for easing in your fabric. So if you've got two seams, you might pin one end and start pinning along and moving your fabric and matching the raw edges. But what you will find is you will get to the end sometimes and you'll have this piece and you'll think, why have I got that? Have I cut wrong or something? But what you need to do is ease in the fabric. So you pin at the bottom, pin at the end, and then you look for a notch if there's one on your pattern. So I've got an inseam notch. So So I'm going to pin there, and that will show me how much ease there is between each end of the seam line. Here I've got a little bit more than on the other side of the leg. That's allowing for a 3D body to fit on flat pieces of fabric. So you start splitting the ease. I use vertical pins for that. And then I can switch to parallel just to fill in between. It means I don't need quite so many pins. You'll find this particularly useful on princess seams or on leg seams. Now when I sew, I will have absorbed the ease in those two lengths of fabric. Number 15 is to switch up your pinning when you're putting seam allowances together. So if your parallel pins are working really well here, but when you get to the intersections where the seam allowances are, you might need to switch your pinning so you go vertical now, and that will make sure that the seam allowances are held down while you sew over that bit. When you sew from this side, you will come down here. You don't want to have these flipping over. You'll see what's happening on this side, but not on this side. And if you've got something like Hong Kong seams that are going to be exposed on the inside of a jacket, for example, then you want to make sure that all your seam allowances are open and flat, and they are sewn in that position as well. Number 16 is to use extra long pins for bringing your dart legs together. So you might pin like this, so you put the pin going in and out exactly on the dart leg markings. And then when you squeeze the fabric together, the pins can then be positioned through both layers, and it's even on both sides. It saves you having to wiggle the fabric and get your dart legs uneven. Don't forget, you need to have the pins going in the direction that you're sewing, so you go from the dart bottom to the apex. Number 17 is to use pins to stop you overcutting a buttonhole. So put a pin in each end. When you cut with a seam ripper, the pin will stop you from going any further. Number 18 is to use pins in a cross position, and that's useful if you're matching up seam intersections. So if you just pin on the edge, then you do lose control a little bit of the raw edges. They can tilt from side to side. So ensure you know your seam allowance and pin much closer to where your stitch line is going to be, and then put in a second pin in a cross position, so that will hold the intersections of the fabric. So check both sides, and then you're sure that when you sew along that line, nothing will tilt out of shape. You can go back to parallel pinning just for the pieces in between, but that area there is super secure. You can use it for all seam intersections. It's helpful to hold bulkier areas in place. So now when I sew between here and here, these seam lines will match. It's also useful if you're pattern matching, so make sure that you pin near the seam allowance, not on the edges. If you pin on the seam line, so here in this case it's 15mm, I'll get a much better pattern match if I'm trying to join up two bits of a print. It won't move or stretch out of shape. I'm running out of numbers, but 19 I'm thinking about when you're cutting out. So you might have preferences here on how you cut out, whether you pin your pattern piece to your fabric or whether you use pattern weights. But here are a few tips for number 19 when you're using pins for cutting. So the first thing I'm going to do is check the grain line. I've got my fabric selvage to selvage and everything's lined up. So I want to make sure that that selvage edge is parallel so that I get everything on grain for both the fabric and the print. So I'm measuring from the grain line to the selvage edge and checking that that line is straight. I'm going to pin the grain line first and then pin the other areas. It depends what fabric you've got. I'm okay here. I've got a triple crepe, so I can put my pins right into the fabric and it's not damaging it. So here you want to be careful that you're not putting pins over the edge. If you put pins over the edge like this, you run the risk of catching your scissors or your rotary cutter on them. You might find it easy to put your pins in so that the heads are in the corners so that you can see that bright colour when you cut up towards it. Or you could put them in the other way with the slim edge pointing out, whichever you find easiest. With this fabric, I can have pins out of the seam allowance, but you might need more pins for slippery fabrics, and you might need to pin in the seam allowance if pins will damage your fabric. You might choose to leave the pins in and fold everything up. You want to be careful you don't snag any of your fabric with loose pins. I like to have my pins back in rotation so that I can use them for sewing. So you can mark the pieces so you don't forget which are which. For number 20, I've left the great big elephant in the room, which is should I sew over pins debate. It really is up to you. I don't sew over pins because I don't want bent needles. I don't want to have to change my sewing needle if I've just put a new one in and I hit a pin. I don't want to have to keep slowing down to go very slowly over a pin. I don't want pins to start going down into my foot plate. I don't want pins to make a baggy loose stitch where I'm very slowly going over the pin. I don't want to have any timing issues on my machine, and I certainly don't want a bill for having my machine fixed if something goes wrong. All that alongside protecting my eyes. I just don't sew over pins, but you might have a different take on that. Finally, without a number, I am a little bit interested in how you store your pins. I keep my pins in tins. It's up to you. You might choose to keep your pins in pincushions, in tins, in the boxes that they came in. I'd be really interested to know how you store your pins. One of the pin storing products that I absolutely love is a pin magnet. You can put the pin magnet near your sewing machine, your cutting table, your ironing board. You can literally throw pins towards it and they will stick to the magnet, so you can concentrate on keeping your stitch line. Of course, it's also great for those pin tin disasters where you drop your pins either on the floor or the table. You can pick up lots of pins at once. It makes it really quick and easy, and you can also spot any pins that shouldn't be there. So I've got a bent one and a small one. That one can go in the recycling. Having a magnet means you might sort your pins into separate tins. I hope you've enjoyed today's whistle-stop tour through how to use your pins in sewing. I've tried to use as many different fabrics as I could, but we would love to see what you have been making with your fabric over at Minerva. It doesn't have to be Minerva products. We just love to see what everyone has been up to. A little photo and a description can be really inspirational to Minerva makers. And you can go and find out some other inspirational makes that you'd like to next put on your list. Thank you very much for watching, and if there's anything else you'd like any help with, then you can leave that in comments and we'll be sure to consider it for our list. Thank you very much.